Welcome, everyone. Today we are talking about belonging as it pertains to workforce development. And with me today is Geoffrey Roche. He is the Director of Workforce Development for Siemens Healthineers. Welcome, Gregory. Welcome to the podcast. Thanks for joining me today.
Absolutely. So good to be here.
Yeah. Well, as per usual, I like to start with hearing a little bit about your career story before we get into our topic. So we'd love to hear, how did you make your way into what you're doing today?
Absolutely. Yeah, so obviously, I always tell everyone I'm son of an incredible nurse. That certainly had a huge impact on ultimately what made me choose and have the privilege of serving in healthcare. Followed my mother, but not clinically. Served in a hospital, actually served in the same hospital as my mother for just under a decade. She wasn't there actually when I was there. She had moved on, but really neat experience. Started in a professional level role, actually, where I was the hospital spokesperson and had the privilege of also being responsible for all of our external relationships and partnerships with the business community, our academic partners, as well as others within the region that we served. And then also through special assignment of our president and CEO, had the privilege of working closely on our culture, employee engagement, and really how we were viewed internally so that we could improve both our internal and our external perception and reality of who we were as an organization. Then had the privilege of serving at two different college and a university on the president's cabinet, doing a similar level role, but on the academic side. That's really where I got a lot of experience, particularly in sort of the leadership development, executive education side of how a university could partner with industry to be thinking about those issues and solving for some of those challenges from a retention, from a leadership development, succession planning. And then actually served at a startup that was doing all that work in the healthcare space, which was a really neat opportunity, working globally, many different countries around all aspects of leadership development, education, and certainly upskilling, reskilling. Done some consulting work as well in both education and healthcare. And obviously, for the last several years have been fortunate to serve at Siemens Healthineers in an inaugural role, focus on how do we help our hospitals and healthcare system customers think through their biggest learning and development challenges as a trusted advisor, help them envision how you can build a sustainable future-ready workforce, and really lean in on sharing best practices and helping them connect to opportunities that are supportive to them.
Nice. I forgot for just a minute that your sort of headline on LinkedIn is son of a nurse, right? And so I don't think we had a chance to talk about this either, but I am the son of a teacher, right? And it just connected for me that I don't think about that often enough, that, essentially part of what I do is teach and coach. And, I don't know that I credit her enough for that. And I definitely credit her for my typing skills. I remember the hum of the IBM Selectric at our dining room table, and she had kind of foreseen how computers were going to become central to work. And I had no choice but to get good at 10 keying. And so my typing skills to this day are pretty fast. That's fun. So tell me, just before we get really into our topic, tell me a little bit more about the charge. I think you talked a little bit about it, but I'd love to hear just a little bit more about the charge of your current role.
Yeah. So, when you think about it, right, there's been a lot of reports, 2027, 2030, others that are highlighting this massive shortage that we're going to experience in healthcare. And it's a shortage, that's multifaceted. One, you have certain experiences in certain academic programs that have, less enrollment or less completion as compared to other years. You also have particularly our baby boomers who have served in healthcare for a long time, making a decision to retire, and you have less retention all throughout healthcare. And so all these three factors have a dramatic effect. And the reality of it is that, it's an industry that's changed so much. And it's also an industry that's not always been the best at being really people focused. And a lot of that is just historic. We didn't necessarily have to worry about people leaving traditional healthcare employers as much before the pandemic. People want to say the pandemic is what caused this. It didn't. This has been a problem for a very long time. In fact, in my hospital administration days, we were wrestling with it and working to solve it. it's a place where we haven't been flexible around shifts. We've introduced new technologies without ever actually asking those who are going to use them why and how it should be used. It's a space where we have never really dealt with the issues of burnout and done so in a people-focused way. And so we've got all these factors that are coming in. And so a lot of my work is really, to help a healthcare system think through what does their ecosystem of workforce look like? Where are they currently getting their future healthcare professionals? Are they strategically partnering with both K through 12 and higher education to really build a future-ready workforce? Are they thinking about new and emerging themes in the healthcare space, like apprenticeships, which have worked so well in the building trades, yet we've been so slow to adopt them in healthcare? Are they sitting at the table with the program accreditors on the higher ed side who may be stuck in the mud or stuck in the 80s or 90s or maybe even before, and challenging them respectfully to move forward? Really thinking through those types of matters. And then, also really being willing to challenge them on if we're seeing specific challenges in an imaging department or a lab department, or certainly in the radiation therapy space through the work that our colleagues at Varian do, being willing to say to them, hey, have you thought about your organizational culture or your employee engagement? Because, obviously when we have the opportunity to be on site and listen and learn, there are things you pick up on. And so you can't just build a sustainable future-ready workforce if you also don't address the current issues within your organization. And so just being there to kind of respectfully challenge that as well.
Yeah, I think if I were to think about, because I've done some consulting here and there with healthcare groups from a leadership development perspective. And interestingly, a lot of people, especially on the provider side, nursing, doctors, specialists, right, they get into it as maybe a bit of a calling. Right. And so I guess my question to you is, like, have we been relying on healthcare being a calling on the provider side and not necessarily, I think, kind of to what you're saying here, maybe not been as intentional on, from a, I don't know, org development perspective or what have you, on culture?
We certainly have, relied on, certainly that aspect of a calling, because we know, for so many, particularly those that are in the baby boomer generation and others, have always said that in many ways is either a calling or they followed the footsteps of a mother or father or a relative.
Family business. Yeah.
Very common. We've also relied on the fact that the benefits have always been so historically rich, a great benefit package in healthcare systems or other healthcare employers. But obviously, as health insurance and other dynamics of the market have changed, that's not necessarily the case anymore. Yes, at one time it also was one of the most PTO rich places, because you could get a lot of weeks. But now you have employers and other spaces that offer unlimited PTO. And so, you can't compete with that. You can't compete with the idea where you could work remotely versus having to work in person for 12-hour shifts versus being able to work remotely. So you've got a lot of dynamics. I'll give you an example that I always think about is there was a Texas healthcare system that was really challenged with some of these issues. And a colleague of mine, this was actually in the nursing space, but a colleague of mine was saying to them, why can't you think about changing the model of the hours and still envision how you can give them benefits? Yes, in times, they have to have a certain number of hours they work to get part-time. But really, this was a situation where they're saying, well, if it was 2 hours less than what you currently give for part-time benefits, why wouldn't you be willing if it meant you could retain them? And the healthcare system's like, we just never thought about that. I think it's these types of things that also we have to be thinking about. And a lot of that is that they've been fortunate to be more of an employer approach versus what's also the best interest of our whole community. And that's what I think is important within this type of conversation.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've seen plenty of that in food service and retail, as well, right? Managing those hours like a hawk and trying not to dip into benefits territory, and yet out of the other side of one's mouth, complaining about retention and how hard it is to find
Yeah.
good help. Interesting. What might happen if you took care of your people and thought
Yeah.
about your role as part of the community? So I know, we're going to talk about, or we're going to jump into sort of talking about belonging here, but I think the connection to culture and everything that you're saying here is, as we think about the challenge of retaining people, how do we make, I guess maybe I'm putting words in your mouth, but how do we move in this direction of ensuring that this is a place that people feel like they belong and are, maybe I might even take the leap here and say they're a part of this community, here. So what has brought belonging sort of to the forefront for you?
Yeah. It's multifaceted, particularly I'll say is, when I look back on my career, there's really only been one true organization where I felt like I belonged. In many
Mm.
ways, felt like there was intentionality around building a community. Yes, there were times where there was disagreement, but so often we were all rowing in the same direction. We may have rowed a little different at times, but we were truly passionately committed to achieving the work that we were doing, and that was in my hospital system. And what I noticed when I look back on that, as somebody now who's also in a doctoral program in leadership, that there's just so much to be said about a leader or an executive team that really wants to engage all levels of an organization in thinking through these matters and also solving for them. I regularly tell the people that I can vividly remember us doing executive rounding where one of our executive leaders would round with a people leader like myself. And the whole idea of that was to literally be listening ears. Our only job was to go out and talk to other colleagues that were on the front lines and make sure that they were being supported, make sure that their needs were being met. And at times for us to ask them if they could do something different about our system, what would it be? And there were so many powerful examples of solutions and ideas that came out of that were both facility, sometimes related, that were people related, you name it, that was just very, very different. And so I can always kind of come back to that. And then serving in other organizations where I've seen leaders not care as much about people, not have a culture that has any sense of belonging, more of a us versus them, or an elitist type of thing, you name it. And I can, as I went through this journey, I can remember a couple of years ago, I was at an event in Denver, Colorado, and it was called the Courageous Imaginator Summit, which was just a fantastic title. And it was, chief human resource officers and leaders from academia and leaders from employers from the healthcare space and people involved in the arts and culture and, music, and very, very eclectic group. And there was a speaker there that asked, posed the question to us that has always stuck with me, that said, what could you or what could someone else be covering in their workplace about themselves for fear, retribution, whatever the case may be? Or what are they covering at home? Or what are they covering at church? Or what are they covering wherever about themselves? And I remember walking away and thinking about, that was such a powerful question that also gets at this idea of belonging and mattering so much, but also gets at the both personal and professional nature of who we are as individuals. And, that was a soul searching moment for me, because all these years I've been so wholly committed to this, but I wondered, what am I covering? And, through that process, an incredible process, not an easy, very challenging process, a very mental health filled process, I was able to realize what I was covering. And what I realized was that so much of that was also embedded into my fear of being in communities that wouldn't necessarily show me value, appreciation, respect, understanding. And, ultimately, I had to be, I had to accept, but I also had to feel that coming out as a gay man after living my life as this heterosexual, father of 3 children, married at the time, to a woman, just that whole element of all of that. And yet, certainly in many ways took, not that I'd say this one event, but certainly in a big, significant way. And so when I start to unpack a lot of that, truly, Ken, I start to think about how many other people are in that exact situation. And then when I think about here where we sit today, where we have people who are trying to erase people or tell people that they really, really don't matter, it not only infuriates me, but when I think about the mental health aspects of just what it's like having been through it, it also greatly concerns me. And for me, there's no one better than for a leader in an organization, regardless of level, to acknowledge the opportunity and the moment they have to break it or make it for another person. And I'm just fearful there's more break it type of leaders than there are make it today. And so, that's some of the thoughts I would share.
Yeah. There's so much that you said in there that I want to dig into. So one comment I want to make, and thanks for sharing your personal story. I've had the, I guess, luxury of representing, the centered norm, so to speak, right? And yet I've had experiences where I don't know that I feel like I belong here, right? And in one super short story, I'll keep it very short, that kind of stands out as I was entering into this organization, and my manager, who knew me, had said, "Hey, this organization's not very colorful." So basically was asking me to tone it down, like tone down my personality or what have you. And so I would say for 6 months, I did that, and I was miserable. And the moment I started just giving myself permission to be myself, everything improved. Not just my own sense of belonging, but in general, how people received my work and my consulting. And so I think there's something to, and I did feel like I belonged more once I gave myself the permission to just be myself. Right. But I want to acknowledge, while telling that story, I represent kind of the centered norm, what were the commonly agreed upon, I guess, centered norm. And luxury that I have is to give myself that permission to just be myself as well, regardless of what I was told this culture internally might be. There's something you said at the beginning, or not the beginning, but what you, in your answer to my last question that I want to come back to, which is walking the floor with some of the senior leaders, right? Kind of walking the floor and talking, because one thing that I've talked about with folks is it's one thing for senior leaders to say what they want the culture to be and to be trying to drive some kind of a culture. But if you don't walk the floor and hear from your people what the culture currently is, your ability to transform it, let alone support what might be a working culture, is going to be, in conflict. It certainly can be shaped and directed from the top down, but it's lived and breathed right from the bottom up, right? And so if you don't have your finger on the pulse of, well, what is the culture today? Because the diffusion from senior leaders to the shop floor, so to speak, can be pretty huge, right? What we say at the top and what's actually happening, on the ground level. So I was happy to hear that. And I'm just curious what your experience with that dichotomy of, here's what we want this culture to be and what is actually happening today.
I think so. Certainly, at least in that experience, what I observed was there was so much of a culture there that was built on, we are all in this together. And, the team members felt inclined to literally share anything and everything with that executive. And, and he was such a fantastic leader that as he would hear from them and he would elevate that whatever they shared to wherever or whomever,
Mm-hmm.
he would make sure to go back to them and let them know what was done. Because he always, he didn't forget where he came from. He started in food services. And so for him, the idea that he went from food services all the way to an executive vice president job, never wanted to be a CEO, but made it to the top of where he wanted to be. He wasn't going to forget that. And I think today, at least it's been my experience, those leaders are rare. And that should not be the case because all of us started somewhere. And frankly, all of us have a duty and a responsibility to lift others up so that they can achieve what we have achieved.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the piece that gets frustrating for me is I truly don't grasp why we can't be more people focused. Yes, I understand it's not easy work, but it's not that difficult for us to simply sit there and listen and ask people, if we could change one thing about this workplace, what would you like it to be? Now, yes, you've got to create psychological safety for them to be able to honestly share that with you, which again, we had in our organization. That was, and that was before we even talked about psychological safety, but we had so much, and I think a lot of that honestly started because of how our executives were. We would go into meetings where we were interdisciplinary, groups working on things. The executives, in most cases, there were some who are not good, don't get me wrong, but in most cases would say to the team, I want all of you to share your thoughts before I share mine. And they would wait until the very end. And when they did share, they were more summarizing what they heard and giving input to where they think they were going to recommend or an action they were going to take based on what they heard. They weren't just telling everyone, well, whatever you shared was great, but here's what I'm going to do. They were really taking into account that. And so I think there has to be a more intentional focus on that because frankly, we all have seen it in our careers. People closest to the work absolutely know what needs to happen.
Yeah. Well, and I kind of thinking about belonging, your story, and even just thinking about the brief story I was giving, right? That when you feel like you belong, right, your engagement, your work product, your ability to drive belonging for others, psychological safety, there's so many connections to what that unlocks. So as a critical driver for culture and kind of coming back to where we started, which is, looking at this future of, there's this projection of there being a shortage of workers in the healthcare industry where you're working. So how are you trying to pull this through your work, pull belonging and culture through with your consulting work and how you're trying to help organizations, I don't know, reevaluate or drive this?
Yeah. In many ways, it's really a matter of asking questions, bringing it up, particularly the reality in healthcare. And again, this is the challenge we sit where we sit today is, much of these types of topics have been so, as we were talking about earlier, linked to diversity, equity, inclusion.
Mm-hmm.
And which, again, I don't understand in any way why that's become such a bad thing, other than, it's coming from people who, in my opinion, are filled with hate, to be quite honest. And so, but I do think that particularly in healthcare, because of the whole federal contracting piece and the aspect of Medicare and Medicaid,
Mm-hmm.
hospital systems and other employers have had to really think carefully about how they approach these matters. And I think it does represent a great opportunity in conversations that I have with them to really think about it as community and think about it as belonging and think about how it is and what it is that you need to do to really lift up everyone in your community and give them a voice. Allow them to feel that they're heard, they're valued, they're appreciated, they're respected, allow them to feel like they own the organization. And what I mean by that is like allow them to own the work that they're doing and you want them to achieve. And when they need to grow from it, you grow from it. You learn from it together. Allow them to feel like it's not just work, but it's also joyful and it's impactful, and they're getting to see the impact of the work that they do. And I think also make sure they feel that they matter. And so a lot of it is really asking leaders what they're doing in this space. How are they leveraging their ERGs? What are they doing from a policy perspective? What are they doing to ensure that there's feedback on leaders that is manageable and also accountable? What are their practices? I mean, everyone in healthcare wants to talk about they care about retention, but we know people leave bad leaders and frankly bad managers. They don't really leave organizations generally, and so what are they doing to unpack that? When that happens, what data are they truly reflecting and looking at? And what are they doing to hold those managers accountable? I think there's just, it's those types of things. And then on the other side of it, it's also still respectfully encouraging them and challenging them to not give in to what is considered right now, a very hate-filled agenda. Because you know what? You do need a diverse workforce in healthcare. It's the only way to achieve higher quality and better service for our patients. When you have somebody that can relate and resonate with a patient, 9 times out of 10, the care quality does improve because they understand their specific needs. They live those specific needs. And so it's just a very, very different matter. And so don't give up on finding access and opportunity, whether it's, different types of connections into communities, whether it's engaging, more diverse public schools or private schools, whatever the case is, there has to still be intentionality around this. And frankly, for the chief legal officers and regulatory folks, be willing to stand up and talk about that this is still the right thing to do. And be willing to go to court if you need to over these matters because it is the right thing to do. Lives depend on it.
It's interesting because, so a couple quick reflections on that. Let me start nearer in from today. I think it's interesting watching those organizations who are going public on either side of the fence, right? With we're abandoning what we're doing or we're doubling down on it.
Yep.
And watching how the public is reacting to that, right? So it's interesting to observe that maybe even literally in my own backyard in Minnesota.
Yep.
But as I reflect to my time that I spent in DEI, it was a lot of rapid change in a short amount of time. I was in DEI from 2019 through late 2022, or early 2022. And what I felt in a very short order, we started from this place of always needing to share the ROI of what we were doing, how it's good, how diversity, equity, and inclusion, all three, right? They are individual things, but also interrelated things, right? Diversity can sometimes in an organization be summed up as the numbers and how we're measuring people, equity being, are people getting what they need, as opposed to just equality being everybody gets the same, and inclusion does everybody, and I think inclusion and belonging, sometimes synonymous, sometimes defined separately, but do people feel like they're included here? Can people's voices be heard? And when I started my time in DEI, again, I feel like there was a lot of always talking about the ROI as we were working on rolling out just about anything. But in this short span of 3-4 years, at least in the organization I was in at the time, there was such a pull for it. There was give us more, particularly around equity and inclusion. Right? That's what the organization as a whole wanted more of, and we kind of got to this place of we don't have to be sharing the ROI as much, because it has somehow gotten to the core of it's the right thing to do.
Yep.
But I feel like the train switch, the track switch has been flipped back to probably back into ROI land, right? Of getting more transparent with sharing how this is good for business, how it's good for society.
Yep.
It's just I think about that from time to time with where we're at today, this sort of like 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of progress. Right. And I what's interesting is the thing that has sort of caused the most angst, trouble, agenda today has been the D in diversity, equity, and inclusion, has been the numbers and the processes that companies have put into place to
Yep.
Try to reflect their community, right? Having been close enough to that work, not directly involved, but close enough to it, I know what has been said about it, right? And trying to talk about, again, ROI, but how it's good to represent your community, how that affects who you're selling to and customer base and all that. And we've seemed to have, be in this place where companies are throwing the entire thing away and abandoning the equity and inclusion and belonging aspects because of what might need to be a recalibration around one aspect of it. When, in my own opinion, I just don't know that I think if I were to think of what went wrong in that space, perhaps if we were to say, look in the mirror, is there anything that we could have done differently in the conversations that I've been having with folks? I don't know that we were ever as transparent and vocal about what we were doing and why, and why, particularly on the diversity front, right? I think we were very, because it's just such a dicey area, and that's where I'm seeing a lot of companies pulling back from. So I know I covered a lot of ground there, but just curious what your reaction is.
No, I think you're right. And I think in many ways it's actually very well connected to the same thing that learning and development faces, which is that we have normally reported, the number of students in a program as compared to reporting and aligning our learning to business strategy, and how without that learning, we wouldn't have achieved those business results that quarter.
Right. What was learned?
I mean, you can absolutely articulate that, especially when you partner with a functional unit and say, hey, what's your biggest challenge this quarter? What can we do to change that? Put a program together, get some intentionality around that, study it, get the results, etc. I think the same thing really is important in this space too, because the difference, I think, is you have to, because of how polarized society is, you can't just assume you can present it as a nice to have. It's got to really be presented as a must have. And I think, to your point, there are some incredible results that some organizations have seen, have experienced, but that story has just not been told enough. The story has been fabricated to think that there's so specific numbers that an organization has around this number of. I mean, yeah, I'm sure some people do, right? But in most cases, most organizations, we're just, in my opinion, trying to do a better job at career and economic mobility. Trying to do a better job of lifting up their community. To try and do a better job of better articulating how to approach solutions in one community, as compared to another. I mean, it's just, I think it's just the nature of where we are today. But I think to your point, what we should learn from it is, let's do a better job of telling the stories, and let's ensure we have really effective data that's measured and evaluated. And let's recognize some people are just going to be naysayers and they're hate filled, and we don't have to worry about them, because you know what? At some point, we got to view them as just the wind that blows, because they're not going to come along, and they're not going to be willing to come along.
Yeah. I'm glad you said. I used to say, so when I rolled out an allyship program, I used to say, I don't think I'm that interested in converting the unwilling. I want to double down on those who are willing I want to pull the fence sitters off the fence onto
Yep.
the side. But in terms of, where the effort is best spent, progress is found going with those who are willing to go.
Absolutely.
And so I want to bring this back to belonging just for a minute before we get into our advice section, because, again, I think everybody wants to belong, right? And I think if we were, and it's so much easier to talk about in one-to-one or, small group settings, right? That there is always a room, I'm sure, that you've come across in a week or a month, literal rooms that you've been in where there's probably at least one room where you feel like you haven't belonged, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where you just didn't belong there. And I feel like those have been some of the best conversations that I've had in my time in D&I is talking about inclusion and belonging, is to say, there probably isn't a whole picture of inclusion and belonging. It's where do you need to be included? Where do you feel like you belong or you don't belong? And how do we make improvements, in those smaller spaces even?
Mm-hmm.
So I think, as we were talking before, I feel like belonging should be, a very acceptable thing to be talking about. So I'm just curious, as we're kind of getting towards the advice section, where are you trying to take this? Where are you seeing your next, 6, 12, 18 months, going when you think about this?
Yeah, I think it really does come down to there has to be a lot more work to educate leaders at all levels on their responsibility around this. Because what we know is everyone desires community. Even if you're introverted, you still desire community. You just desire in a different way as compared to an extrovert. And so we've got to really be focused on it. We've got to ensure that it fits our specific organization, whatever that looks like. We have to be willing to hold people accountable. And we have to be willing to educate. Because ultimately, when you have community, there's just so much that can be experienced there. We can learn about one another's culture. We can learn about their specific stories, which helps us to learn why they do what they do. It's also where we see imagination, creativity, and discovery thrive. It's where we see, and it's been studied, it's where we see business performance significantly improve. And so I think it's time for organizations to really understand those matters, get engaged. This is also where I often say, you got to have the board and the shareholders also to understand why this is important, because they need to hold the executive team accountable to these things. It's one of the reasons why I argue regularly that fiduciary of a board or shareholders also is people. You can't just say finance, because without people, there is no finance. And so there has to be much more emphasis, from that end as well.
Yeah. I know I keep saying we're about to get to the advice section, but I keep coming up with things I want to ask you, which is, so one more, and then we'll get to that. Because I know where we started here was you were talking about the healthcare industry, which is where you've spent the bulk of your career, and this sort of, evolution or need in the healthcare space. I don't think healthcare is alone, right, in the need to focus on culture and belonging. But I would love to, before we get to the advice section, kind of wrap on in your known domain of healthcare. So where, how are you, or what do you feel like the future has to hold, looking at this future of workforce shortage, and, how are you trying to push the needle or move the needle when it comes to culture and belonging as it pertains to addressing, that future workforce shortage?
Yeah. So I'll say that I think what I'm finding is that every time you have this conversation, there's so many more light bulbs going off. And so, last fall, I was fortunate to bring together a number of healthcare leaders from different systems and really delve into this at a national conference, first in like a workshop type of fashion, and then at a dinner.
Mm-hmm.
And what stuck out to me was how emotional these leaders were and yes, their strong desire and commitment to want to solve for these issues, but also how challenged they felt that they weren't getting executive buy-in to really want to or need to.
Mm.
And so, what really sticks out to me is so many of these leaders and these functions have been charged with improving retention. You think about HR, you think about L&D, you think about org development, even like the mental health and wellness area of some roles have those areas as focus too. But you can't do those things if you also don't focus on belonging and mattering.
Yeah.
It's common sense. And so if you're a leader out there saying, well, I don't understand why we're struggling retention. Well, if you don't have a practice around these things and you're not holding leaders and professionals accountable, if you're frankly continuing to ignore what are truly some of the most important issues, and let's not forget, for the younger generations, we know these issues become even more important on how they evaluate a workplace, then you know what? Just have the sucky retention, because you're only going to continue to have it.
Yeah.
And it's only going to get worse. And you know what? Your recruitment is going to get worse. And so I think that's the piece that we need more executive buy-in and people to really wake up and realize that when we focus on these things, results happen. And also people's lives are better. That's the other piece of this that I think is so critical.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So we're running short on time. So I'm going to give us a violent shove into advice land. Oh, we have a guest.
Is it thundering? Yeah.
Yeah, I heard it too. I would love to hear one piece of advice for leaders out there. What's one thing you would push leaders to do more of, less of? What's your advice?
Yeah. I would definitely encourage leaders, particularly on these topics, because if you're a leader that cares about these issues, you obviously are also tired. And, you may get frustrated at times. And so certainly really encourage them to find whatever it is to practice self-care and give yourself grace, because, we know that it gets tough when you're doing this and you're just, there's still others that you feel like are rowing against you. So that I would definitely share. The other thing I would say is, particularly today, for all leaders, we really want to embed sort of a culture of gratitude within all the work that we do, both for ourselves, but also for others. Because, these are not easy things to do either. I mean, I'm not sitting here and saying you can get belonging and mattering done easily and quickly. It takes time. But when you do it, you really build the best human-centered culture and community. You really bring the best out of people. And so I think bringing that, gratitude into this, really allowing people to both feel and be the best that they can be, is truly transformational.
Nice. So when you think of people who support leaders, so HR or senior leaders who are supporting other leaders, what's your advice for them?
They need to care about these issues. And they really need to understand that while they sit there and they care a lot about the financial figures associated with recruitment and retention, that there's nothing greater than taking the time to care about whether someone in this department or this department feel that they belong or matter. If they can take that time, if they can get out of the C-suite and walk or virtually engage, ask people how they feel, create that psychological safe environment where the people are going to be willing to share with them their care, their concerns, their ideas. It'll go such a long way. Get back to the basics. We're all humans. Show respect and a desire to want to appreciate and relate and connect, and really, again, build that community. We need leaders at all levels who understand that, that they can make it or break it for another person, but also for the rest of us.
Yeah. I think the thing that ended up converting me to continually watching anything that Gary V puts out there. Gary Vaynerchuk is his focus on servant leadership, right? That you work for your people don't work for you. What are you doing? I feel like he makes it really practical. Like, what are you doing that helps, bring the best out of someone?
Yeah.
Okay. So our final piece is kind of the grab bag section. So I'll tee it up in one way, but you take it where you want, which is, if people are interested in more Geoffrey Roche in their lives, where can they find you? What's any, parting thought you have for the audience today?
Yeah, no, happy to connect. Certainly LinkedIn is a great place to connect with me, and obviously, attend many, L&D conferences, particularly in the healthcare space and such. So always happy to connect as well.
Nice. Well, I really appreciate it, Geoffrey. I'm so glad you were interested in coming on the podcast today. It was a great conversation. And I'm excited to see what else you do out there. So I'm now, a fan and watching you like a hawk as well. So really appreciate you coming on today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you. Take it easy.